Oh, hey there, gang. This one is for all the bassists. Finally, the time has come. You're so excited, I can feel it. They're always after me to do a video where I'm working on a bass, but the truth is, I don't see very many of them. I think Dave gets them all. Dave's World of Fun Stuff. The biggest irony is actually the gentleman who owns this one brought a couple of guitars to Dave for setup in the last month, and somehow I was the one who got stuck with the bass. This is a slightly more challenging job. It's a little more involved than a setup, as you can probably gather. This is a 1974 Fender Jazz bass, which has been made fretless. I don't think it came from the factory that way. Regardless, it's seen a few changes over the years. It's a very well-traveled bass, and it's had a lot of play. The fingerboard on here predates the current owner, and he says, in his words, it was hacked up long before he got it. But whoever put it on there didn't do such a great job of gluing it down or leveling it. So 25 years ago, he did his best to level sand it out. And that did not leave much material on the board. It's really thin. Almost comically thin. Also, I think the neck may have been shaved down on the back as well a bit. At the first fret, or where the first fret would be, if it had frets, it's about 870 thousandths, just under 22 millimeters, which is almost normal. It's close, but it does not really get any thicker as you go up the neck. Around the 12th fret, where it should be, it should be up to almost a full inch up here, it's still about the same. So that can pose some issues for adjusting the truss rod. The neck can behave in some funny ways because of that, so we shall see. You can see that some wood has gone missing up here on the treble side. So I'm going to replace the fingerboard for him. The radius on this thing is eccentric. It's so incredibly small. This is a 7 1/4 and it's rocking the boat like nicely. So I think it's less than 6 inches, if you can believe it, at the nut end. And it goes up to maybe 8, 8.5 at the top end of the board. I don't know whether it was by design or maybe it was just inadvertent, but he managed to plane a compound radius into it, which is probably a good thing. On a fretless bass, it's probably not as critical, but if this was a guitar with frets, playing with something less than 6 inches, you wouldn't be able to bend a note more than even a quarter tone would probably choke it out against the next fret up. So, we're going to try for something a little bit more conventional. He's going to end up with a slightly thicker board, and he's okay with that. We talked it over. He said, no, just make it right. I went looking through the pile to find some material to use for this, and I came up with this dusty old example. We decided to go with ebony for its long-wearing properties. It seems a natural choice for a fretless. It's the same thing they've used for upright basses for centuries at this point. And this still has a sticker on it from a time when I could buy it for 27 bucks. Beautiful piece of black Gabon ebony that is quarter sawn, which is a real trick to find. So I must have had this for at least 15 years now. It's probably ready. I think we can put it to work. I'm going to try and establish the center line. It's not easy. This neck has very few straight lines left on it, but I'll measure around the nut and also over the truss rod screw, which I assume is centered, and give myself something to work from. I'll also make a perpendicular line here at the 12th fret, just as a reference point. Before we go too far, I want to make sure the truss rod works. I'll back it off a little bit to start and then go forwards, and yeah, it functions. The owner had just installed some fresh new tuning machines here. They still had the plastic on them. I'll have to take those off for the time being while I remove the fingerboard. I'm using my side heating blanket I usually use for bending sides. It wasn't difficult to get my knife in around that split area. It was in fact 2 pieces, and the first piece came off pretty easily. The rest of the board was sort of up and down. The glue, it's a strange adhesive. I'm not familiar with this one. It wants to pop free. It's not like hide glue. It's not like Tite Bond. Don't know what it was. And it left quite a lot of residue. While the neck was still hot, I wanted to get it clamped down to a flat surface to try and keep it that way. A couple of chores for the body. This has got EMG active pickups in it, and the 9-volt battery for those is stuffed underneath the volume pot in the control cavity. He's worried that there's not quite enough clearance for it, And although it's been like that for a very long time, he thinks that maybe we might have to remove a small amount of material under there just to make it sit properly. And the other thing is this bridge. This is an aftermarket badass bridge. Is noticeably crooked. Like it's way, way, way off. I don't know why that would be, other than just someone misdrilled the holes. Or I suppose perhaps if the string spread on this is slightly too wide for the fingerboard, canting it like that would effectively reduce the string-to-string distance a little bit and gain you maybe a millimeter. So maybe I shouldn't fool with that until we've actually got the neck back on and the strings in place. But the other thing is this doesn't have a ground wire, so we'll have to ground the bridge. We'll unscrew some screws and have a look on the inside and see what wonders await us. Well, there's no battery in there at the moment. We should probably put one in there and see what it does. With the battery in there, it is in fact pretty snug. You can see there's a cardboard spacer underneath the plate there to help things out a bit. But I am going to excavate a little. I want to make sure that I don't cut through the other side of the guitar, so we'll take some careful measurements here. We'll take off the tired old electrical tape there to remove the pickups. And all the hot leads have been soldered together. So I'll figure out which one goes where, mark that down, and take them apart. The owner said that he didn't even want to try and remove these screws himself, and I don't blame him. They look pretty bad. With a sharp screwdriver, I managed to get most of them out, but there was one in each pickup that absolutely refused. It's just too stripped. So I'm going to have to come up with a method of removing that. Now, I'm familiar with screw extractors and things like the Vam pliers and that kind of stuff, but in this case, with these tiny little heads set right up close to the pickup housing with very little clearance, half the time it's just quicker and easier for me to cut a slot. I'm not going to try and save the screw, obviously, and just get it out any way I can. I'm marking the length of the proposed battery tray, and I'll protect the surface of the top with some tape, because the router is going to be running up against it. I'm just going to do this by eye with a pattern cutting router bit that's got a bearing on the top of it. Slowly excavate that channel. And there's the result. Only had to take off a couple of millimeters. Let's have a look under the bridge and see what's going on there. Well, there have been multiple installations over the years. It's not its first rodeo, that's for sure. I think this is going to be its fourth set of holes. Checking for the ground wire here, I can find an exit point here in the pickup cavity, but the one that's back here seems to be missing. Or maybe it's been plugged. Why would that happen? No idea. Unless maybe when it was being stripped, some of the stripper and the paint got together and filled it in. I couldn't poke it out there with a little awl. So I'm going to fill in these bridge screw holes. I'm drilling them to depth to make sure they're good and clean. And while I have the drill out, I'll also make the pilot hole for the ground wire. This is a very long, skinny, and as you can see, slightly flexible bit. It's called an aircraft bit or an installer's bit. It lets me come at things from a low angle and from a distance, so I'm not running the drill chuck into the surface of the guitar. So I'll put some glue in the holes and some dowels. I'll come back later and flush them off. And I'll replace those nasty old screws with some fresh new ones. I'll use some heat shrink tubing this time rather than electrical tape. I'll solder the leads to the battery and connect them to the pots as well. You can tell these pots have been around for a while and they've seen some action. I'm not the first person to do this. Try to find a clean place to solder on the grounding wire. To keep the battery from wiggling around, I put a little piece of foam back tape on the sidewall there to keep it from moving. Now we don't need that cardboard riser. It fits flush. I'm going to clean out the pots with inexpensive contact cleaner, electronics cleaner from the auto supply place. I'll do some preliminary leveling here with my long sanding beam. This is mostly to get off the old adhesive. There are some intricacies around flattening this neck which I'll go into later. There were some obstinate spots which I used a chisel for. Very irregular surface. Just using a card scraper as well here to get off some more of it. I decided I had to fill what was left of the voids from the old inlays there. They're around 20 thousandths. I didn't like the idea of having all that empty space underneath the fingerboard. Probably wouldn't be good for tone. So clamped on some little blocks of wood here and let that dry again. Flush those off of the block plane.
Turning to the fingerboard, you can see I'm in my short sleeves now because I'm going to work up a sweat. Planing ebony. You want the sharpest edge you can get on your tools when you're working with ebony because it's a nasty sort of material in a lot of different ways. It's hard, it tends to have reversing grain, and it dulls the edge of your tool pretty quickly. And the shavings are okay, but when we start sanding this stuff, it gets everywhere. I'll mark out for the nut location using a protractor, scoring the line. I went back and forth with the idea of maybe cutting it beforehand using a router, and then I thought, no, it's probably more precise to wait till afterwards. I'll cut it by hand. I've taped the outline of the board here so that it shows up better on the dark confines of my shed where my bandsaw is. With the board cut roughly to shape, you can see one of the main issues here is the person who cut this the first time managed to plane the neck below the surface of the truss rod nut. So my ruler rocks there, and there are a number of other areas where there are serious dips and bumps and things going on. So I excavate a little trough so I can turn the truss rod nut and also glue the board down flat. Before doing that, I decided it was probably a good idea to apply a light coat of paste wax to the sides of the neck. At this point, I wasn't sure if I was going to retain that surface there or not. As it turned out, the side walls on this neck were very uneven, and most of that got sanded away, but I just decided to be neat about things. Using tight bond this time, clamping it face down to this. It's actually an MDF board with melamine facings on it, so it's reasonably flat. But wait, how did he get those parts clamped together, especially since he's already got the nut laid out in the right spot? It's got to go super glue. A little super glue on both ends, a little bit of accelerator, locks them in place until the glue can cure, and things don't slide around.
I've left this to dry for a few days, not just to let the glue harden, but also to give the moisture in it some time to absorb evenly. Some of the water evaporates, some of it gets sucked into the neck and the fingerboard, and it'll dry slowly over the next few months, but it swells the wood a little, and letting it dry is a good thing. There are a couple of little places here and there where I couldn't flatten the neck perfectly due to the exposed truss rod nut and the anchor, and places where it previously was cut too thin. So before I'm done, I'll have to inject a little bit of black epoxy in there to fill any gaps. It's time to trim it to shape, and there are going to be a couple of challenges. The first is, whoever carved it the first time managed to angle the walls of this area here that goes into the neck pocket. If I put a square on there, you can see how much it tips inward. Enough that even with a generous overhang on the board here, its edges still don't reach perpendicular. There's a gap there. So it's never going to be geometrically perfect. Not a possibility. But I'm just going to do my best. The other thing is, tempting as it might seem, I can't just run a plane along the edge of the ebony here and plane it down flush with the point where the neck wood meets the fingerboard. I could, but that would be wrong. Let me draw that to explain. Here's the shape of the neck without the board. If I put something square on there, this part here, this transition, it becomes very uncomfortable. It's not easy to hold on to. What I really want is something that sort of sneaks up to the top edge, like this. And actually, when I put the radius on and soften the corners, this becomes something of an acute angle. It's much more comfortable to play with. Now I'm limited to the shape I've inherited, but I want it to be pleasant to hold.
Scribing the straight lines for the fingerboard taper. Again, the geometry here gets complex because part of this top surface is going to get cut away when I put the radius on it, so I have to guesstimate an extra amount for that to happen in. It's not like carving a regular guitar neck where the finished fingerboard is glued to a rectangular block. Here there's a curved, receding, kind of irregular surface under there, and I have to mate that with the ideal straight line buried somewhere in the ebony. It took a long time. A lot of planing, filing, scraping, sanding, checking, etc. Roughing out with the block plane was the fun part. It was around here that I recognized that the other person had probably glued their finished fingerboard on and used that as a template with a pattern making bit to route the sides of the neck to match it. They're flat, And it also explains why it's narrower than a standard jazz bass all around. The nut on this is a full 2 millimeters narrower than standard. So I recognized there was no way I could really make a perfectly smooth curve. The owner has played and enjoyed it with the flat sides for years, so all I could really do was blend them, and I was going to lose the finish, which at this point was actually mostly sweat and hand oils, so I just, sanded it clean. With the shaping done, I could figure out the alignment between the neck and the bridge's eventual position, using some dental floss to line things up. I can drill the bridge screw holes with this. This is a self-centering bit, sometimes called a VIX bit, that runs in the countersink and keeps the screw centered in its hole. Before I go and sand the top of the fingerboard, I need to deepen the scribe line for the nut's position. We're in the neck jig now, and I'm sanding the top of the fingerboard perfectly flat and level, checking often. Then I use radius sanding blocks to arch the fingerboard. It's another compound radius going from 9 inches at the nut up to about 12 at the top end of the board. I mentioned that ebony dust was nasty stuff, and it really is. It gets everywhere. It's like coal dust. You'll be cleaning it for weeks. You want to wear a respirator because it's a sensitizer and probably just toxic on its own. So after sanding those radii, I go back with the level to blend those together and make sure it's good and straight. Then polish up using finer abrasive sandpapers and up into the micro mesh to make it really shiny. Here's a shot of the radius. It's nowhere near as dramatic as it was in the previous board, but still very comfortable, I think. There was a lot of extra room around the end of the neck in its pocket due to its having been shaved down, so I thought it would be a good idea to make a couple of shims to take up some of that extra space. I made one for the bass side and another for the treble, fit those in pretty carefully, glued them in place, and then I also stained them down a little bit so they kind of match the body and wouldn't be so obvious. I gave the back of the neck a light sanding to clean it up. You can see there's a pretty dramatic reversal of grain there right in the center. Doesn't seem to affect the stability though. The truss rod adjusts it pretty evenly all along the width. I taped up the board and gave it 2 very light coats of satin lacquer. Not so much that you could feel it, it's just there for a little bit of protection. There's the board. You can see I also lightly chamfered and rounded the edges so it's comfortable to hold and to play. I cut the nut slot by hand. It's good practice and a skill builder. Using this flake and cut technique, and then I flattened the bottom using files to make sure it was good and square and true. Fit the nut and stacked up some feeler gauges. Give myself about 30 thousandths above the surface of the board. I like the spacing on the old nut, so I use that as a reference. Should feel familiar to the player. I'll roughen those slots off the guitar. I need to refine the end of the board a little bit, so I'll start off with the block plane. Have to be careful with this cut. The fibers are unsupported at the end there and they could easily pop off. So I don't take it all the way across. I stop short and I'll finish that off with a file. This little ramp here makes the next step easier, in which I take a dowel with some sandpaper wrapped around it and produce a little scoop. I'll apply a little oil to the fingerboard here. This player apparently favors round wound strings, which kind of surprised me for a fretless. The board probably won't stay this pristine for very long with round wounds, but flat wounds might not give him the sound he needs. With the nut in place, I can finish up the final slotting and do the rest of the setup. And there we have it. I know I say this every video, but I'm not a bass player, and I'm sure as heck not a fretless bass player, so your laughter will be excused. Just this one time, though. As always, if it ain't broke, don't break it. Have yourself a happy holiday. I'll probably have another video for you next week, because I still got work to do. Thanks for watching. Take it easy.